So summers at UUI are often a time when we return to the core values and stories of our tradition to reground ourselves, kind of UU 101 to prepare us for the new church year. This summer has been no exception. We've returned to our traditions, and when you talk about our tradition, you're really talking about our traditions, several traditions, because Unitarian Universalism was formed by the coming together of two distinct, vital, creative, heretical, and by the mid-20th century, really small American religious traditions, Unitarianism and Universalism. It is sometimes said that our Unitarian tradition was characterized by a commitment to freedom, reason, and tolerance, and on our Universalist side, we were characterized by faith, hope, and love. So this summer, we've been looking at these 6 values in turn, talking about what they meant to our religious forebears and what they mean to us today. In August, we're talking about the Universalists, faith, hope, and love. This Sunday, we're talking about hope. So the most famous story in our Universalist tradition, the story of Universalism's founding in America, is in fact a story of hope. Now, Universalist ideas had made their way to America informally throughout the 18th century and on the eve of the country's independence, and they were carried by German freethinkers and pietists, by Quakers and Baptists, who brought these ideas with them from Europe and carried them into the American countryside. But there was no Universalist church, and there was no organized Universalist movement, and there were no Universalist preachers. But then a New Jersey farmer named Thomas Potter, who was interested in these new ideas that he was hearing about, he had a vision that if he built a church on his farm, God would send a preacher to spread the gospel of Universalism in America. So Potter built a chapel on his farm in New Jersey in 1760, and there it stood, empty but hopeful, for 10 long years, waiting for someone to fill it. And then finally in 1770, an impoverished, newly widowed, socially disgraced, and emotionally wrecked former preacher of Universalism from England named John Murray, fresh out of debtor's prison, was stranded in New Jersey when his ship ran aground, and it ran aground outside of Potter's farm. Now, Murray had sworn never to preach again, but Potter prevailed on him to preach in his chapel. And so it was that Murray very reluctantly preached his first Universalist sermon in America, and in the process, he rediscovered his own hope. He reclaimed his voice as a preacher, and he went on to found a Universalist church in Massachusetts and launched the Universalist movement in America. True story. Now, the most famous quote in our Universalist tradition also involves hope and the same Reverend John Murray, but it is less of a true story in the sense that it is false. You recall last week we talked about how the Universalists, on fire with their zeal to spread the news that God is love and everyone is ultimately going to heaven, well, they took to the countryside and they preached the Universalist message as far and as fast as their horses would carry them. Now, this is quite in contradistinction to our Unitarian ancestors, who were more content with keeping their new religious insights, well, at home and for themselves. It was joked back in the day that Unitarians believed in the fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of man, and the neighborhood of Boston. So provincial were they. But not so the Universalists. The Universalists were taking it out wherever they could, and so successful and committed to spreading the message were they that the Methodist missionary Peter Cartwright complained that everywhere he went on the frontier, some Universalist had already beat him to it, spreading their heresy. And this anecdote comes from the book Universalism in America, a documentary history. So in their prodigious feats of evangelism, the Universalists were carrying out John Murray's stirring charge to a new generation. He said, "Go out into the highways and byways of America, your new country. You may possess only a small light, but uncover it, let it shine. Use it in order to bring more light and understanding to the hearts and minds of people everywhere. Give them not hell, but hope. Give them not hell, but hope. This is far and away the best-known saying of John Murray, perhaps one of the best-known quotes in Unitarian Universalism. It appears in pamphlets, on posters, in keychains, on the internet. It's been set to music. You'll find it in the back of our gray hymnal here in our sanctuary. Since we're not in the sanctuary, you'll have to take down your family copy of the gray hymnal from its well-worn spot on the mantle. Or just trust me, it's in the back. There are two problems here. First, John Murray's most famous quote was never actually said by John Murray. What had happened was, in the 1950s, someone named Alfred Cole wrote a pamphlet about our Universalist history in which he sort of fancifully imagined the spirit of the ages like speaking to John Murray and conveying this message: take to the highways, give them not hell but hope. But then in the 1960s, a guy named Henry Cheatham was writing a Sunday school text, and he found those words, and he put them in that Sunday school text as though John Murray had actually said them. And then in the 1990s, another guy writing a book picked that up and carried it forward, only now was being cited as a true historical fact, and so on and so on. You can read about this in a 2012 UU World article by Peter Hughes called "Who Really Said That?" It's actually a little embarrassing how many spurious, misattributed, or wholly invented quotes are common currency in our Unitarian Universalist folklore, some of them in the back of that gray hymnal. But still, give them not hell but hope surely stands as the greatest thing John Murray ought to have said, capturing the spirit of the young Universalist movement. But here we run into problem number two with this important and famous quote. Because early on in the Universalist movement, almost right from the start, we start to run into the question, well, can't we give them just a little hell? Like just a little bit? But give them a little bit of hell and then also hope is not as catchy. But it represented a very real question that Universalists had as they grappled with this new theology, because here's the thing, sometimes people behave really badly. Sometimes people behave badly in ways that affect us personally. Sometimes people cut us off in traffic, they dog-ear books, they steal money, they're cruel, they're selfish. And sometimes people go to their grave neither understanding nor repenting of their individual acts of wickedness. Sometimes people die not in the least bit sorry. And for those Universalists who were eventually called ultra-Universalists, this did not matter at all in terms of what happened after you die, because God is love. God is love. And in the end, when you die, you immediately go to heaven to be reclaimed and rejoined with that love. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. In the popular culture, this idea was both mocked and feared and held to be the ruin of all morality. If there were no punishment for bad behavior in the next life, what hope was there for good behavior in this life? But even for some Universalists, this idea was, well, unsatisfying. It didn't seem right that everyone went to heaven in exactly the same way and with no consequences for their bad actions. So the Universalists generally evolved two responses to the problem of reconciling their hope of everyone going to heaven with the reality of human bad behavior. And the first response, called restorationism, is the little bit of hell idea. In this theological view, everyone goes through a period of correction after death. Not necessarily torment, not the fires of hell, right? But a time of accountability where one has to confront one's evil and seriously be held accountable for it. And the greater the evils committed in life, the longer it was believed this period of unpleasant correction. And the purpose of this correction was to enable the soul to learn the error of its ways and grow in holiness until it was appropriately worthy to join God's company in heaven. And this view also seemed to meet the emotional need to believe that some form of justice is eventually served, and it served as a deterrent to bad behavior in this life, because the worse you behaved in this life, the longer you had to endure this correction, right? So the restorationists and the ultra-universalists, no hell, a little bit of hell. They argued vociferously and sometimes bitterly over these two visions for universalism in the early history of our movement. We're talking the 19th century. And it's of purely historical or academic interest today. Whether you are punished before you go to heaven and how much is not a live conversation in Unitarian Universalism today. It's not an active concern. But the second response to the problem of reconciling hope and human evil is an idea that goes back to at least Plato in the West. And this is the idea that evil or sin or bad decisions or whatever you want to call it is its own punishment. The punishment for acts of greed is living with the consequences of having a greedy heart. And the misery and isolation and estrangement from one's neighbors and one's own humanity and the life-giving wellspring of goodness that comes from that. And in this view, acts of selfishness, dishonesty, exploitation, anger, they're self-punishing. And so the Universalists argued that there was no need for punishment in some future afterlife because sin, evil, whatever you want to call it, inevitably leads to misery in this life. And the liberating power of the Universalist message, all are loved, was not just in freeing people from the oppressive fear of hell in some imaginary next life, but also in freeing people from the very real misery of sin in this life. Because they believe the universal love of God points to a universal love among humanity, which calls us to acts of charity, compassion, kindness, and caring. These actions free us from the very real hell we have created for one another on earth. And as Universalism discovered humanism in the 20th century, this message would only become more prominent. The vision of an anthropomorphic God of love and the promise of heaven in the afterlife was replaced among many Universalists with a universal spirit of love, calling us to create heaven here on earth. And the wages of human sin writ large were the devastation we see on earth: poverty, militarism, racism, exploitation, and so on, the hells we build for each other. And then wrong behavior, selfishness, greed, hate, well, they lead to unhappiness and impoverishment of the soul, the hell we build for ourselves. And this view of human evil, which again is a very old view, implies that evil is not only a cause of suffering, but a mark of suffering. No one wants to be trapped in a cycle of self-harm. No one wants to suffer. The modern aphorism is maybe familiar to you: hurt people hurt people. And this view calls us to compassion. I'm reminded again of the Buddhist story of the two monks who were crossing a road. A man driving a carriage at a reckless speed comes barreling through, heedless of the monks. The one monk dives out of the way, narrowly escaping being run over. The man on the horses with the carriage drives off without stopping. The monk gets back up to his feet, dusts off his clothes, and calls after the carriage, "May all your deepest desires be fulfilled." And the other monk says in amazement, "Why did you say that to that maniac? He nearly killed you." To which the first monk replies, "How unsatisfied must one be in life to behave so recklessly?" Although we no longer talk so much about heaven and hell, this universalist theology about the mutual entanglement of harm, trauma, evil, and the healing power of compassion is very much a part of Unitarian Universalism today. It finds contemporary expression in our movement in conversations, for example, around justice and restoration in the criminal justice system. Prison abolitionists believe that consigning people to the hell of prison is a misguided response to actions that harm the community, a response that in fact compounds the harm, creating more hell on earth. And what is needed in this view are structures that promote healing and accountability and the restoration to community. We're going to explore this idea in more depth later in the fall. But today, as we talk about hope and hell, I'm thinking about the coronavirus, and this fourth surge that we find ourselves in. Because it is sometimes hard to feel hopeful as the numbers climb and the hospitals fill up again. We're all becoming intimately familiar with an entire Greek alphabet of viral variants. I'm saddened for the people who are sick and their families and their loved ones. I can't imagine the frustration and exhaustion and soul sickness of the doctors and the nurses and the other healthcare workers who are going through this all over again. They are surely at the breaking point, and the system they have been faithfully propping up for over 16 long months may yet break. And for all of us who are feeling the whiplash of shutdown and reopening, who are dealing again with this heightened anxiety and fear and isolation, it may be hard to feel hope in this moment. What people are feeling more and more of, apparently, is anger. Anger. People are frustrated and afraid and impatient and frankly over this, and they're angry. And everyone has a different story of who is at fault and how, who might be making a bad situation worse, who is preventing us from getting back to life as we want it to be. And each with their different stories seems honestly unable to grasp the worldview of the other at all. And it's not always for lack of trying. Americans with different perspectives do talk to each other, right? Just not always successfully. And we seem to be in a moment where building bridges to one another is very difficult. And there are other groups, we should add, that actively seek to promote misunderstanding and polarization and demonization, sometimes because it is very profitable as a media model, sometimes because it's an avenue for political power, sometimes because they seek division for its own sake, sometimes because self-righteousness feels good. We're all encouraged in different ways and daily now to condemn each other to the various little hells we might imagine for one another. When we are so polarized and divided in the face of a giant collective challenge, hope seems even further away. Where do we find hope? Perhaps hope for us is like that of the poet in our reading, a hope that scarcely dares to hope, half-hearted, poker-faced, a hope that is calculating probabilities, checking the news, that approaches the radiant city without ever arriving. Maybe you're feeling that. I know I certainly have my own share of moments like that these days. But maybe when hope is hard to find, this is precisely when we are called to be the hope that we are looking for. Consider hope not as a state of mind, but as a conscious practice. We might think of hope not as something that is found, but as something that is created, as an action, as a word, as a nod or a smile, as a creative act or a gift, as music, as listening, as an unexpected generosity. We might think of hope as something we choose to put out in the world, and if we know or believe that others are also putting hope out into the world, we might suppose that those individual acts, those individual small acts of creative hope might add up to a real presence in the world, that it can matter, that it can make a difference. What does hell look like? Well, we know it all too well. It looks like hate, contempt, mistrust, indifference. It looks like isolation. It looks like prejudice, self-righteousness, selfishness, and fear. What does hope look like? Well, hope looks like compassion, openness, curiosity, connection, and care. Hope looks like acts of love and kindness that create windows of possibility, that create this moment where something new or something different might happen, could happen, to break the cycle of hopelessness. Hope may be an invitation to a conversation that 9 times out of 10 goes nowhere, but then that one time in 10, hearts are opened and a real connection is made. Hope may be listening to the story behind the story that allows us to set aside our defensiveness and replace judgmentalism with compassion to better help each other through this national calamity. Hope may be taking a breath and not saying the sharp thing or not responding to the angry provocation. And hope may be reaching out to one another again, one more time, and saying, how are you managing? What will keep your spirit up? What do you need to be safe? How do we get through this together? Hope for us Unitarian Universalists is always ultimately grounded in love, in our faith that love acts with power and persistence in the world, that love can open hearts, that love can be a force for healing and transformation. We are the love people, after all. Perhaps in this very hard moment, we are called to remember love's original charge to us, to take to the highways and byways, metaphorically speaking, and give the people not hell, but hope. May it be so.